Yeah, so I was talking with Steve earlier, but um, one of the questions that I've been asked recently was around error budgets and this concept of I deploy a new version of my code and then I monitor my logs and I check to see, hey, have a lot of errors been occurring? And then if I see a lot of errors, I want to go ahead and automatically roll back to a previous version. And so I had a couple of thoughts on that, Steve. I was wondering if you had any thoughts before I shared my thoughts, because I'm going to have some negative thoughts basically to share.
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing is error budgets. Um, uh, I suppose it's probably worth us defining error budgets. So
Yeah.
my understanding of error budgets is from site reliability engineering, where you set up an expectation of like an objective for your services, and they act as a guide because if you are exceeding if you're exceeding your reliability targets, you're maybe not innovating as much as you ought to be. And
Hmm.
then if you're failing to meet those targets, then maybe you're prioritizing innovation too much and you're making things worse for users. Is that the error budgets we're talking about here?
Yeah, I was thinking more along the lines of being a little bit more simplistic, meaning that I start seeing critical errors appear because of this new version, and these are errors that I was not expecting to see, and I need to roll back automatically in some sort of form or fashion. That's kind of
So
in my mind's, that's what I was thinking, not necessarily like I've released a new feature and it's not functioning or behaving the way I'm expecting it to behave. And that's a whole different thing than releasing a new version of my application, because in reality, you should be separating the concept of deploying a new version of my code versus I would need to release a new feature or functionality to my user base.
yeah, so we're talking here about you deploy a new version of software and then your event logs start filling up with bad news.
Yeah.
We're talking about that scenario. So yeah, I think it's definitely a signal you should be listening out for. And I remember my very first DevOps role was that I would sit next to the ops engineer when a deployment was happening, and we would have the event log open. That was
Yeah.
like the very first DevOps, because before that we weren't even there when they deployed,
Mm.
and that was our main signal to see if something was going wrong. But I'm interested in why you would automate your response to that signal.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was a bit concerned about that because I I've I had kind of something similar when I first started automating deployments. We deploy, and then after we deploy, we'd look at the error logs and they go, "Oh my gosh, we need look at all these errors coming through." But in my particular case, oftentimes it was just one person, and they're just hitting the same button over and over and over again, and it was just throwing errors left and right on something like that. And so you needed to have a bit more context into why the error is occurring, not that, oh my gosh, look, errors are happening, errors bad. And in fact, some errors are just caused by a configuration that you weren't expecting for one particular user or for a subset of users. And is that enough to say, I need to roll back to a previous version versus I need to contact that person or dive a little bit more into their configuration and kind of understand it? So just triggering something automatically, I think, is very dangerous because without the appropriate context, it's hard to know. And then you end up spending so much time on all of these different rules and all of these different processes to hopefully automate successfully.
It's interesting actually because you just reminded me of a situation I had where we deployed a new version, and obviously we had users around the world, so there were always people using our app.
Yeah.
And we deployed a new version and we started getting errors. And it turned out that the errors were caused by people that had opened a form before we deployed.
Mm,
When they
yeah.
tried to submit the form, we changed it, right? And
Yeah.
so it didn't work and we got errors. So if we had automatically rolled back in response to that, we would have then seen a second wave of people who opened the form after the deployment, who then tried to submit it after the rollback.
Yeah.
So like you can end up making a situation worse if the cause is something to do with the deployment, like something cached for a couple of minutes that is causing you a problem, or you've changed like if you've got like some kind of anti-forgery key that comes through, and when you deploy, you
Yeah.
somehow invalidated that. That just happens again if you then roll back.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thought that I had, yeah, exactly that. And then the other thought that I had was, I mean, if you look at what we do at Octopus Deploy, you define your deployment process once, and I'm going to reuse that across multiple environments. And so, let's say I'm deploying from my main branch, and I want to deploy to test my staging environment, then production. And we also really want to make sure that you deploy the same artifact that you built for test, staging, and production. I'm not rebuilding each time I go to a different environment. And so the question that I always have is, well, if you deploy the same artifact and you're using the same process, why weren't those problems found much earlier in the process? Why wasn't it found in tests? Like,
Mm.
why were these errors not discovered? Now, I understand that, yeah, you're going to run across use cases you weren't expecting. You're gonna run into certain situations where there's a configuration you weren't expecting, or like you said, the website browser was still open to the old version, and that happened to me as well, because people would leave their browsers open because I was working on an internal application. They just leave it open overnight, and it's like, oh man. But it happens. But my question is like, why wasn't so much of these problems caught much sooner? Like, if it's such a critical issue, how did it not appear in your testing environments? What's different between your testing environments and production? Why aren't you testing in a production-like environment? So it's almost like by having the concept of error budgets and automatically rolling back, what you're doing is you're shifting your quality gates to production, when in reality they should be shifted much sooner and finding these errors. Um, and again, the when I say the concept of deploying a new version of code and releasing new functionality, to me, and you might have a different experience, but every single new feature I had was really the cause of almost all my new critical errors. It wasn't I released a bug fix and I caused more bugs from that, or I released a performance fix and suddenly caused more problems. It was almost caused by a new feature or functionality, and that's when you should be using something like feature toggles to enable and disable that functionality. So I can roll out a new version of code with that toggle disabled, and then hey, it's probably not going to throw errors until I hit this toggle. And then but I have a much more controlled way to do it, because then I can progressively deliver to maybe a subset of users and verify, yep, I'm not seeing any sort of problems. People have been using it, everything along those lines.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Breaking that dependency, like things can happen when you're doing a deployment. Like network issues can happen.
Oh yeah, 100% time.
You're, you're causing, depending on what you're using, like some kind of service may recycle when you change objects that it serves. There's all kinds of stuff that happens during a deployment. So if you can reduce the categories of error from everything that can happen during a deployment and everything that can happen when you expose a new feature, and just split that in half so that you immediately have halved like the search area if something happens. Like you'll be able to say, okay, we've done a deployment, and we're seeing some issues, and we can investigate it, right? And it's
Yeah,
like you can then decide, if we invalidated the cache as part of our deployment, we would solve this problem, and then you
yeah,
make your process better. And then separately, you can toggle on a feature or even toggle on a specific implementation of a feature. Because quite a few times we've had a working feature, but we've wanted to completely overhaul it. And so we
yeah,
toggled between those two versions of it. Um, you want to do that separately and uh, get that feedback about the feature and whether that works and performs well and all of those things. Because I think it can be difficult to simulate what people do in real life, even during your testing.
oh
Um,
yeah.
so when you switch a feature on and people use it the way users use it, they'll have special ideas about something they can do with it that you never anticipated. Um, you can deal with that separately, and it just immediately halves the amount of places you need to search for how did this happen.
Yeah, 100%. By splitting those two apart, you definitely have it. The only other thing I would want to add on top of that was you should be making also small incremental changes and not releasing features in big bang type of situation. And I know I personally, when I implemented Octopus Deploy, I didn't really change how we built features. We build them in a feature branch, and we delivered them in a near complete state. It's like, oh, here's the new feature. It's ready for you to go. But in reality, I should have been incrementally building that feature and rolling out those increments to production and then you hiding it behind a feature toggle. But then having that capability of the feature toggle, if I could then target a subset of users and say, hey, this group or this team or that particular user, I'm going to enable it for them first. They're going to be my alpha customers. They're going to be my beta customers, and have them use it in production like it's a regular feature, like it's ready to go. And then they can incrementally change it as well. And so again, back to your point of like you're not gonna be able to test every possible permutation or how users are going to use it. So get it in the hands of users, but have it in a very controlled manner and say, we target a very select group of individuals, or hey, here's my alpha customers. And then once you get to a certain state with your functionality, then I want to target a beta group, which is much bigger, and then I can find the final, you know, edge cases or make sure that it's going to work at at scale or find any of those big problems. And then at that point, now I'm ready to release it to everybody else. But the whole point of it is I'm incrementally making changes, and that's one of the policies, excuse me, one of the processes that we've changed at Octopus over the last couple of years. Is before we would release features and functionality in big bangs. I don't know if you remember the Spaces feature when that was released.
I
Um,
missed when it was released because I was using Octopus at the time. I didn't work here yet, and Spaces
mm,
came out, and I completely missed it. But I found out about it when I arrived, and I was like, that I really
yeah,
needed that. How did I miss that?
yeah, and that was worked on in a separate branch for over a year. And so it was basically merged in and it was released and as 2019.1. I remember that version because those are because I have so many docs that I had to write. It's like, all right, when you go from, anything before 2019.1 to 2019 dot whatever, just make sure that, you back up your file storage for the first time because we actually go in and make changes. Anyway, but that was kind of like it was kind of a big bang release. It was like, here it all is. But now, like if you look at what we're doing, say with our process templates, we're incrementally adding functionality. And so basically every time I sign in to my cloud instance, I'm seeing some sort of new feature or some sort of change or something that's happened. And I'm like, oh, well, that's better. Or sometimes like, I think we can make that a little bit better, but we're able to get that faster feedback, and we really close that feedback loop, which is really the whole point of it. That way, you're building the right feature and it's going to work, rather than, well, I'm going to push it out and hope for the best.
Yeah, I
Are
remember. Oh, sorry, go on, Tony.
yeah, this may be a silly question, but are there any scenario, and I suppose it's a little bit devil's advocate, are there any scenarios where you might want to, like, say you have a category of error or issue that is like sub-zero, really bad,
Mm,
and
hmm.
where you want to build in a safety net to say, if we do see this error, then we do want to roll back. We want to automate that. Or is that still something you would try to roll forward?
I have quite a strong opinion on this. Um,
Go
if
ahead.
you if you can genuinely plan for the event, you can make yourself robust to it. So you might have an incident that was caused by, as part of your deployment, you need to call out to an API and your credential expires. And it's undesirable for that to happen halfway through your deployment process. So you might redesign your process to make a call early on to validate that your credentials work, and that makes it more robust. Great. That's the kind of thing you can do. So if you can plan for it, you can actually improve the automated process, not by rolling it back, but by making it more robust for working, right? And
Yeah,
it will tell you if there's a problem up front, and then it will try and do the deployment. If it's something that you can't plan for, then you don't know if a rollback is the appropriate response. So this is where you want to move from trying to have a robust deployment process to having a resilient one. And resilience comes from people making a decision. They need to look at it and decide what an appropriate course of action is. And everyone's doing things differently. Um, I think it's easy for us to think of it in terms of an ideal DevOps team, and
yeah,
their database changes are always backwards and forwards compatible, and they've separated out all these dependencies, and it's great. But if you're working somewhere where maybe you've deleted a column and you've deployed your database changes and your new application version, if you roll back that application version, it's not going to work because it depends on a column that doesn't exist in the database. So now you have to also think, am I going to roll back my database, and how do I do that without losing data? So it's a much more complex thing. So it's quite situation dependent. but I think the real value comes from a human looking at it and deciding, and hopefully, as well as fixing the problem with the deployment or with the software, whatever, wherever the problem is, hopefully on top of that, they also think, is this something that we can now plan for so that we don't need to intervene again in the future?
Mm.
Yeah, failure is the best teacher, and building out those processes, building out a robust process, building out, however you want to do it, the resiliency. And when you do have a failure like that, the answer isn't I need to build a process that will roll back and on an automated fashion that will check it. The answer is always this happened. How do I prevent that from happening again or causing some sort of error? Back to your point with the API, I worked on an application that we had to call out to at least 10 different APIs that was owned by like 5 different teams. And they could be doing their deployment at the same time, and that was fine. And so we built within the application code base itself the ability that if we reached out to that API and we got an error back that was unexpected, we would show a message to the user, and there's like a little pop-up. It's like, hey, we're unable to connect to this. Please try again. So basically, we stopped whatever we were doing. And then if it continued, we'd log the error and then we'd monitor it. And if it continued, then yeah, we'd make note of it. But if it didn't continue, we'd be like, okay, the deployment completed. Because a lot of times it was just, okay, this was happening. I look at the deployment, they're deploying, they finished deploying, and the error stopped. I'm like, well, okay, I don't need to do anything else around it. And so the application was resilient, and I didn't have to do any other changes. And I'm not going to plan a whole rollback process around something like that. I'm going to make changes to prevent it from going forward. So it's almost like trying to plan for a black swan event. Like
Yeah.
you can't, because you can never expect the unexpected.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And imagine if you, I mean, the black swan concept comes from investing, right? There's like
Yeah,
everyone in the market makes these small marginal gains every day by betting on what usually happens. And the idea was that if you actually bet against that and lost a little bit of money every day, when this big event happens, you can make a huge amount of money, like more than you've ever lost, right? And it's like the opposite of what happens to a normal trader, where they make reliable amounts every day until that event, and then it's like
yeah,
bankruptcy.
yeah,
So imagine if you said, as an investor, whenever something odd happens in the marketplace, my reaction is going to be to buy gold, right? And in a lot of cases, that might be okay. Like if stocks drop, sometimes gold increases because it's like the safe option that people go to. But it's also possible to conceive of an event where that would result in financial ruin, right? And so
yeah,
what you'd actually want is to be given the opportunity to decide before something happens.
Mm.
And when you raise issues during a deployment to a person, almost always the option that they choose and the option that's best for the company is something else other than a
yes,
rollback.
yeah. I I worked on an application, and we introduced an error. I don't know if it might have been me or it might have been one of the programming pairs. Like we had a programming pair, it might have been my partner who was working on it. Um, and we both reviewed the exact same code. So I mean, clearly, I mean, I have much to blame as anybody else. And it was causing such a huge problem that we were considering rolling back the application. And as a company, we had never successfully rolled back an application. So when those words left my mouth, the immediate response was just panic and fear because we had never done that before. And so like again, we were like on that train because and this wasn't something that was occurring during the deployment. This didn't start happening until 8 hours after the deployment. So that means the rollback window is even like your rollback window is exceptionally small. It's much smaller than people could possibly imagine. 8 hours, 10 hours is not it. That's way too past it. So again, when I said I think we should roll back, people were like, "Oh my gosh, are we ready to?" And we were on that train and we were talking through it, and then um, one of us found the issue uh, like minutes before we made the final decision. Well, we found hey, we found the line of code that was causing the problem, and like okay, and then we checked in the change. It was a pretty small change when it was all said and done. QA tested it. We pushed out the fix right away. And we never talked of the rollback ever again. It was like
Did you say
like
that?
no
No, I
no no
didn't
one
say
ever
it.
said rollback. That was never on the
I
plan
was
at
rolling
all.
my chair back. So that's
I,
interesting.
I
Yeah.
kind of think as well, the like if you're doing something like continuous delivery where you're committing your code to the main line every few hours, and you're able to deploy at any time,
Yeah.
it shouldn't be a big deal. If you found the line of code and you fix it, you don't need to do any special process. You just use your usual continuous delivery process to then flow that change through.
That's what drives me nuts when I see this concept inside of Octopus. When people misuse channels, they're like, "Oh, I'm going to have a hotfix channel, and then I'm going to have the main channel. And the hotfix channel goes to staging and production, and then the main channel just goes to, dev test, stage, and production." I'm like, really, the channel should be used for I'm going to deploy to dev only, and this is for my feature branches, so I can get make sure I get feedback faster. I put it into an ephemeral environment. I can test it. And then I have my main channel, which goes off the main branch, which is to test staging and production, any sort of those like static testing environments that I have. That's really what channels should be used for. You shouldn't be using it as a way to bypass earlier environments or bypass anything along those lines or have some sort of special process to deploy to production. Everything should go to production the exact same way. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Like if you're truly implementing the principles of continuous delivery, working in small batch sizes, incrementally adding functionality, always testing. This whole concept of rollbacks and automation and everything like that should really not even be in a topic starter at that point.
Hmm. How
Yeah, you're talking about the line of code as well. Whatever line of code caused the problem that you're now fixing, that managed to escape through the whole process.
Yeah,
So the concept of fixing it through a shorter version of the process sounds potentially like it's a bad idea.
yeah, yeah.
uh,
There's no guarantee you're going to run through. You're going to run the same suite of verification that you would have run for regular production deployment. It's like, oh, I got to get something out there really fast. And I don't know. I just finished rereading the Phoenix Project, and one of the big events occurred, and they're like, "Oh, we just got to fix this problem. We got to get people in the building, get hands on keyboards, solving these things." And one of the characters is like, "No, you're going to make problems worse." Like, "No, we got to show that we're doing stuff," and they made the problems worse. So in the action to just fix it, you might end up in a situation where you've made it even worse.
Plus, the
it,
response of the organization is then interesting because you end up with very long deployment freezes over a
Yep,
critical period of business,
yep.
where they will end up choosing to leave in a critical bug rather than try and fix it because they've been burned by that panic process before.
Yep.
And that's what continuous delivery is supposed to get rid of because now every change flows through very calmly. Even a critical change flows through very calmly. So the chance of that snowballing problem is just so much lower.
Oh yeah.
how how often, Bob, do you when you would interface with customers much more often probably than myself or Steve? How often does this come up as I suppose, a topic in a discovery conversation early on? The reason I ask, it always surprises me when we do message testing for, a landing page or something like that, and we don't mention, say it's a general sort of broad overview of
Yeah.
Octopus, and we don't mention anything around rollbacks, there's always a fairly consistent chunk of the audience that we put it in front of that come back and ask, "Oh, how do you deal with rollbacks?" There's always a
It's
thread in there that comes up.
it's fairly common, um, because oftentimes you're looking at your existing process and you're looking at your previous resolutions and you're thinking, yes, this is the way that we've solved it in the past, or we think this is the best way to solve it going forward. So yeah, rollbacks is something that typically comes up much more frequently than I would like to admit, versus the other way around, which is no, I should always roll forward. It was it's an It's very interesting because I don't know who or what or where is just promoting this idea that you can automatically roll back changes successfully, um, without, as Steve has so eloquently put, have someone in the driver's seat making the decision. Uh,
Yes.
that's I I was a developer for 15 years. I'd done thousands of deployments, um, hundreds to production. I never rolled back successfully, never and ever.
Oh,
It was always a roll forward. Um, any time that we thought that the problem could be fixed by a rollback was almost always fixed much safer and much faster by rolling forward, even if our process was an absolute disaster. That one example I gave earlier about rollbacks, and we never mentioned rollbacks again, and we never rolled back, and it was 8 hours after we did the whole thing. Um, Even then, and getting a change up to production still took several hours, because it was such a manual process. Even then, that was so much more preferred over the risk of rolling back. And the big thing is the data loss or the data corruption. And
mm,
that is such a huge problem. If you have a database, it's just a no-go in my
mm,
mind. The whole
yeah,
concept of rollbacks is just a no-go.
yeah, that makes sense. Is it fair to say there's obviously a technology as part of this conversation and process, but
Hmm.
it's as much a mindset change probably in some organizations than either of those a process or technology change as well.
Yeah, I think so. I it's funny because with technology, with the platform as a service and Kubernetes especially, the ability to revert or roll back or go back to previous versions is so much easier than it's ever been, because you look at Kubernetes and it keeps the previous version of that image or previous versions of the image in the cluster for quite a significant amount of time. Same thing with like AWS Lambdas. It's, you can set up aliases and you can route traffic and do all this other stuff. So this whole concept of going back to the previous version is so much easier than it's ever been. But again, you really need to think about the impact of the decision to roll back. It shouldn't be left to a machine or some sort of script, because no matter what, that script is not going to have all of the context, or it's going to be very simplistic and it's going to miss something.
Yes. All right. So we have, I think over the last while, and from the chatter I can see with sales and some product folks, we have been talking with more customers and potential customers in the financial services industry space. And there's themes that sort of come through with most, if not all, of those conversations around audit and compliance, and some
Hmm.
of those pains that they're currently seeing in their current process. They get pinged for an audit, and everything kind of goes into panic mode, and there's lots of manual searching around for in various systems across the organization. And I suppose that's probably one of the key use cases that we can talk to as Octopus if you have that consolidated into one place. But I'm interested in either of your opinions on that or what you saw in the field from talking to people, um, either some of those scenarios or some of the, I suppose, outcomes if we look at that then from an Octopus lens, what that looks like.
Yeah, Steve, do you want to go first, or I can go first?
I'll jump in.
Okay.
I started out in compliance for a company that did self-invested pensions, so lots of regulations. There was a big document called IR 76, and then there were lots of little documents called statutes, and we had to make sure that we did everything according to those rules. And in order to pass audits, we had to demonstrate we had processes, and then we had to evidence that we followed the processes. But I worked for someone who was a bit of a compliance pioneer, and she wanted to be a good partner to the business. So, what she was interested in doing is finding out how we could help the business achieve the results that we needed, which ultimately is making things safe for the customers, without adding all the burden to the teams doing the work because they're already busy. And because I had that experience, when I then ended up being in charge of a development team, I looked at designing processes that would tick all of the boxes for compliance with the minimal effort.
Hmm.
So when I got audited, instead of this mad dash to kind of present compliance theater for 2 days and prepping everyone saying, pretend that you use our processes. They're here. I know you've never looked at them before. It was all baked in. So we could just demonstrate it. We could pull up our deployment tool and say, this deployment was triggered by this person at this time. The process was changed by this person. Like you could literally just pull up all of the records. And that's really what we should be aiming for is you just use your tools to do your job normally, and the evidence is all collected, and the controls are all part of that process that the tools encapsulate, so that you can focus on delivering features, operating applications at scale, not collecting checklists or trying to trick people out. Like some compliance teams like to try and lay little traps and things, but it's more about making it so it's just you get it for free. That's the goal.
And I
Yeah,
suppose one quick just on that specific example, if I'm thinking from the mindset of an auditor then, and I come into your scenario, my mind's already kind of at ease. It's kind of like you have most of this covered. I can see it here. But if you go the flip side, where like you called it the compliance theater, I think it was, where if they start to find creaks in the system, they're probably gonna like double click on almost everything to find where's the issues. And when they start to find them, that'll open another can of worms left, right, and center. So there's almost a double whammy. You win, and the auditor kind of wins at the same time, but which also results in a win for you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the interesting thing is when you can demonstrate a good compliance story to an auditor, they will very happily point out ways you could improve it. And it becomes a really good partnership.
Yes.
If you're doing compliance theater, they don't trust you. They know that you're messing around and that you're not doing these things for real. So they then have to go into like double checking mode because their company's exposed by your compliance failures as well because they're certifying whether you're safe or
Mm.
not. So it's a different relationship. Compliance theater is very much adversarial, whereas when you show them how you are meeting the compliance needs really well, um, number one, I've often found auditors are quite excited and they'll start asking what tools are you using because they then want to tell their other customers who maybe haven't solved those problems that this is a potential option. But they'll also say, would it be possible in this tool to put in this extra control because that would actually prevent this kind of problem? Great.
Nice.
yeah. I mean, when I worked it was ostensibly a bank. It's not directly called a bank, but we when we were building out our deployment processes, when we were moving away from our old tooling onto our new tooling, one of the things we made sure of is we included basically the equivalent of an in-house auditor as part of the process, who is very technically savvy. And so we could build the processes as we were doing this with them in mind and them in the room, and they could provide their own, opinions, provide their own suggestions of how we could do certain things, how we could set up our RBAC controls, how we could get this type of verification. And then they could also see the tool and say, oh, this is where I get this information. This is where I get this information. So they could train other people on their team. So when the auditors do come and say, well, how you deploy to production, they can just pull up the tool because we gave them access, read-only access, but we gave them access. They could show the audit reports. They could show them the exact things, and they go, okay, we don't really have to worry about that particular thing. And they're like, great, this is, we're done with this. We don't really have to think through any of those types of things. So it was interesting because once we set up that whole process with the auditors, we never really, the in-house auditors, we never really heard from them. Again, outside of like in terms of like asking for audit requests or asking for proof that we did X, Y, or Z. I don't recall hearing from them very often after that because they could self-service, and that was huge. Because then they could turn around and do whatever they needed to do for to satisfy whatever. But on the flip side of that, I worked for a company where we had to worry about PCI compliance, which is always fun. And the level of effort I remember some of the developers going through to prove that our application code was PCI compliant. I mean, it was several days of gathering information, meeting with various people, doing any sorts of things. And, for good reason. I mean, I completely understand why. But at the same time, the trust clearly wasn't there. It was that adversarial relationship versus a partnership.
PCI compliance is an interesting one because once you've passed a PCI audit and you've made the changes to the features around payment information that you have to
Hmm.
put in, you then become an accidental auditor for the whole rest of the internet because every time you use a website and it's like, oh, we've remembered your card details, you end up saying, well, you shouldn't have remembered the CVV code.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah,
why have you remembered that? That's not PCI compliant.
yeah. Yeah, thankfully it happened just this happens long ago that most of the PCI compliance stuff has kind of fallen out of my head at this point. The big thing I just remember is that obviously you can't store anything unencrypted at rest, and even in flight, they were really everything had to be encrypted at a point of view. Like if we wanted to decrypt certain things, I remember we had to create a special library, and that was the only thing that could decrypt, and you can only ask for like one thing at a time, and it was a whole thing in order to do this. But it was just to satisfy the PCI compliance, which again I understand completely why it's there. Um, but again, if you have an adversarial relationship versus a partnership, it just creates so much more overhead than really you want because you're trying to add features and functionality that benefit the users. Um, so
Mm.
Yeah, a great
And
compliance team always wants to help you achieve the actual end goals. There are lots of rules and reference numbers and all sorts when it comes to compliance, but a great compliance team is interested in why do those rules exist and are we achieving that? Because it's quite possible to tick boxes on an audit and then still end up leaking information and having
oh yeah,
security flaws and all sorts. So we want to make sure
mm,
we're achieving those end goals. We want to keep people's personal information private and their payment information completely secure. So
mm. And I suppose if we think even adding an octopus layer to it, what are those three or four things that people's eyes light up when we talk about it in that sort of domain? I know these things like RBAC controls, we can stream audit logs out to various platforms, even right up to process templates that we're talking about
yeah.
quite recently. Are those the kind of things in the mix, or is there anything else in there that?
It it's also the deployment history, going to a deployment screen and being able to say, this is the person who triggered this deployment. This is when it was done. If there's any sort of manual intervention, this is when that manual intervention was approved. So any of those activities that occur. So the whole concept of not just auditing, but saving all of these activities. And with the version control functionality that we have within Octopus, you kind of get the best of both worlds because you get this process change by this person, but then I can go to the Git log and I can see the actual line of code that was changed by this particular person. And we can also build in things such as approval workflows with version control because I can say main is a protected branch and I require a pull request. And that pull request has to be done by, say, GitHub or somebody else, and that has a whole approval workflow on top of that. So, again, you're building in the workflows on inside of the tool that make auditing so much easier because they can just go through and go, yep, it's configured correctly, happy days, that type of stuff.
Mm. And I suppose it's probably a force multiplier if you have a large bank or financial institution that has hundreds, thousands of applications, and if you have all of that in one place versus multiple different systems, it kind of just scales that
Yeah,
pain up or down depending on which way you're looking at it.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I also think back to things. We have the process templates. We also have the Terraform provider that can also be used as a way to establish standards and enforce standards because you're using desired state to manage various settings. So you can't turn on or off this particular thing, or if you want to make this particular change, again, you have to go through Terraform to provide any of those things. And that, again, you're relying on the technology to again be a force multiplier. And back to the whole concept of continuous delivery, computers automate repetitive things. Humans make the decisions. And so there's
Mm.
something like that, verifying, you're following the process that you have this approval workflow or anything like that. That's what you should be leveraging your technology for. Do you ever, Steve, did you ever have to escrow code?
I was involved
Yeah.
in one project where the code was held in escrow. And that was an interesting one because there was a dispute between the
Mm.
vendor and the customer. And yeah, super interesting. And actually, the end result of it was that um, escrow is completely useless if the problem is that the software just is never going to get to a point that it's going to be useful,
Mm. Yeah.
because it's just as hard for you to take that code and try and make it work as it is to just
Yeah.
write the thing from scratch. Like you're
Yeah.
looking
Yeah.
at like 10 man years of effort in a code base that you suddenly then just get given, and you get none of the knowledge about any of the decisions that were made about it.
I never encountered escrowing code at any the company that did PCI compliance. I never encountered it at the bank. It wasn't until I worked for a company that provided election software to government entities that I learned
Ah,
about the concept of escrowing code, and that was wild to me. But it was if the company were to go out of business, these government entities need access to the code in order to be able to continuously support uh, their elections. I'm like, well, that's probably a good thing. But it was also a way, and it's also a way to, kind of share the code base a bit with these companies or these entities to kind of also prove through it. That was wild working there because seeing the testing effort, that we had dedicated testing labs that were basically, I don't know if they're Faraday cages, but I mean, they were completely isolated. And you needed a badge in, and then that's when they would run all these tests and everything. It was very intense to see. It was a very interesting experience working there.
it's
Can
quite rare
imagine.
to find a real model office environment for testing. They were, I suppose, tail end of the 90s, that was like a big movement, was to set up a fake office running the test version of the software for real, doing real
Yeah.
things with it to see what the results would be. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that we had a whole room because the application I worked on it was on the tablet is when you went and signed in to vote. Um, and so that was all done via tablet. And they had a whole room with every possible tablet that we've ever made and every version that was running in production at that point in time. So if there's any sort of issues, support person could go grab the tablet, insert the appropriate configuration for that particular entity, insert the voter registrations information, and be able to see if they could replicate it and see if they could find an issue. And if they could replicate it, they could send us down and ask us to fix it because of this, or if they were able to, help the customer get unblocked. Yeah, it was rather interesting to see the whole setup to be able to support
Mm.
something like that.
And our elections here are here's a pencil and a page.
Well,
Off
it's
you
funny
go.
because when I vote in Nebraska, we don't use tablets. We go in and it's like a big printout of everyone who's registered to vote at that particular polling location, and you have to find your name, you have to sign in. I'm like, what century is this?
Yeah, that's us as well. Yeah,
Yeah, then they give
uh,
you a little bubble sheet to vote. It's like who you gonna vote for. But then the
yeah,
actual tabulation of the votes that's handled by machines. But
yeah.
yeah, other
It's basically
counties.
punch card technology, right? Because don't you
n-
poke out a hole in the card and
Not
that's your
anymore.
vote?
No, not
Ah,
anymore. No, that was after 2000. A significant amount of money was thrown at various companies to modernize. So yes, it's like it's like university where you had a bubble sheet, but you fill it out using a pen, and then that's what's scanned. A lot of technology, actually, a lot of counties they use electronic voting where you walk up to this big machine. It's all touchscreen. You select who you're going to vote for, and then what it does is it prints out the ballot filled out. So you have that paper audit trail. That's the big one, and then they also save it electronically. And then you can go over and you can drop the ballot off, and then that gets tabulated as well. So you can compare. You know, you always have that audit trail. That's kind of the biggest thing is you always having that audit trail to make sure that it's everything's completely safe, and you can always do the recounts.
yeah, that
Yeah.
makes
Yeah.
sense. I suppose the electronic count is a good indication if the physical account has been compromised.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, and there's just, I mean, always having, Yeah, always having double verify everything like that. It was like I said, it was a very interesting experience working at a company that does, election software. And when I saw in 2020 all the claims, I'm like, yeah, that's not how any of that works. Also, the other thing to understand is that it's the counties run the elections here. The states set the rules. The federal government sets other rules, but the actual running of the actual election itself is done at the county level. So I don't send my ballot to the state of Nebraska. I go and I submit my ballots to, Douglas County. So
Yeah.
to have fraud at the county level, how many counties we have in this country, that's not happening.
Very interesting. That
It's
feels like a
interesting
whole
that they
topic
spent all
on
that
itself.
money modernizing it, and then in 2028 it's all declared end of life.
Well, they modernized it for the 2000s, and then um, a lot of the counties were still using technology from the 2000s, and we were, uh, and so when I was working there, it was undergoing another modernization to, move towards tablets, move towards touch screens, move towards more electronics, but still have that paper trail. So, but it's a very slow moving industry because for rightfully so. Like you can't just there's not going to be a disruptor that comes through and says we're going to completely change how we do elections. Like you don't want to do that. That causes rioting. If when you do that wrong.
Yeah, there are some pretty big consequences with
Yeah, 100%.
voting scenarios going wrong. Yeah.